So this cup is supposed to be green. It's a plastic green cup. It looks blue in my video, so I guess there's some color changing. Everything else looks fine except that. It's really bizarre. Welcome to How to Write Good. My name is Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled Poppie. That's all you need to know. On my site, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour. It is an adventure, the beginning of an adventure series, if I can actually talk correctly. Or you can find my serialized novel. It's really a serialized series because it's getting a little longer than a novel. It's called One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. It is a revenge story, so check that out. It's free because free things are always great, right? So check out both of those. Let me think. Is there anything else? If you want How to Write Good merchandise, you can find that on my site as well. I hope it's still up. I hope that I don't know how many. You have to maintain your site to a certain degree. It's very minimal maintenance and they're very cheap. So if you don't have a website, get a website because they're unbelievably cheap. If you're a writer or you're somebody trying to do something, get one of those. Get a website because they're unbelievably cheap and they don't take a lot of maintenance. But you do need to make sure everything continues to work. So you have to check up on it once in a while and make sure you don't have dead links and stuff like that. And you actually have to use it and upload stuff, which doesn't actually take that much time. But it's just something you take for granted after a while when you actually have it. So yeah, check those two things out. I'm trying to think. Oh, our word of the week. Our word of the week is desiccate. Desiccate. It means to remove the moisture from something. Desiccate. Or it means to cause to become completely dry. In other words, remove the moisture from something completely. So remove the moisture from something. Desiccate. So if you hear like something is desiccated, it means it's very dry. If you are you don't typically use it as a verb. You usually hear it as I guess you do, but it's desiccated. That's what you hear it as. So that's a word, right? Many words that we have. As you can hear, I'm no longer sick, which is a very good thing because the last episode I was very sick. I wasn't unbelievably sick, but I had a cold. And I got in the way of stuff, and not a fan of that. I'm not a fan of that. So we are going to be talking about, this actually comes from somebody I know through the internets. So do I actually know them? That's the question. But this is somebody, someone suggested that I do this as a topic on the podcast. So I will give a shout out in the description of the podcast if you want to know who that is. But check them out. Follow them on Twitter. I should really have their Twitter handle on here, but I don't have it on here in my notes. So we're going to go for it. I will drop that in the description. I can't think of words right now, so forgive me. I don't know why. I think it's the time of the day. It's getting towards 6 p.m. and the world falls apart around 6 p.m. for me, and I start to get tired. Generally, right now I'm feeling okay. I also haven't eaten dinner, so, and no, I don't do these live, and I don't do these the morning of, because that'd be insane. I do these beforehand. So we're going to be talking about world-building disease / syndrome, and this is a little different than what I talk about typically on this podcast, but I think that we can talk about bigger ideas in writing when we approach world-building disease / syndrome. If you are someone who writes, if you don't write fantasy or something related to fantasy, it might be the case that you have never heard of, or you do not have world-building disease / syndrome. I'm going to actually use world-building disease because I think it's easier to say than syndrome. I don't know. But if you don't work in the realm of fantasy, if you're not dealing with something that either is fantasy itself in some way or it's connected to fantasy, then you're probably not doing much world building because you already have a world for you. So if you're dealing with a thriller set in the present day, you're not going to have to do a lot of world building because you're drawing your information from the present day, and people already know what the present day is. You can assume that people understand what you're talking about when you say a car or something like that. I would say that you're probably going to get the different genres. You're definitely going to have fantasy, right? High fantasy. Some fantasies are a little more ambiguous. They don't get into this as much. They don't do as much world building. They present a story. Some fantasy stories are an inch deep. One fantasy story that I would say probably had a lot of world building behind it, but it doesn't show a lot of world building. You have two different fantasy stories that are extremely popular. You have Lord of the Rings, which is unbelievable world building, tons of world building, and then you have Star Wars, which it's a lived-in world. That was how it was made. An excellent idea to do that, but at the same time, it didn't have a crazy amount of world building in it. It had these throwaway lines to kind of suck people in the storytelling to tell people what was going on to make it a believable world. So world building disease, because that's what we're going to call it. World building disease is essentially somebody gets so obsessed. I don't know if you'd even call it obsession, but somebody has a world they're creating because of the story they're writing, and they get so obsessed or they get so interested in this world they're creating, they just do tons and tons of work to create this world, and they end up not writing. And I think that's why people call it a disease. So if you're a fantasy author and you are like, well, I need to have specific details in my story to understand, for the reader to understand, and I need to get these details hammered out so I can understand the story better as well, you might be carried away and you might think, this is really fun. I want to know more about this. Or you might think, I need to know even more about this story. I need to know even more about this world to write it in a way that is realistic, right? And by the end of this podcast, you might be actually a bit surprised what I think about world building in general. So yeah, people world build instead of writing. A few different reasons that people might do this, and this is the boring half of the podcast. If somebody isn't interested in writing, they might do world building instead. When I was a kid, I still do this. I honestly still do this. When I was a kid, I did more world building. I wasn't as interested in writing, but I would do stuff that would build a world. It's a type of play. It's a type of play. You're playing in some way. If you're someone who builds model airplanes or does model trains, if you are into model trains, you're a weirdo. That being said, if you do that, it's similar to world building. You're taking something that is not going to have an impact on the world at all, and you are fleshing it out for your own amusement. And that's okay. There's no problem with that. There's a problem when you neglect other things in your life. And if you're a writer and you want to be a writer and you're neglecting the writing aspect of things, that's an issue as well. But at the same time, you might like world building for the sake of world building. Some people get in. If you know what wargaming is similar to board games like Risk, but you create a landscape. It's really cool, to be honest. You create a landscape. You have these miniature figurines. You paint the figurines if you're really into it. You set up a battle, and you do war games with these miniature figurines, and there's rules to it and everything. It's really kind of cool. I had a teacher way back when who actually did this, and my teacher, he was really into this. He would go to conventions, I believe, and he said one time, and I think this is cool. He said that one time they created Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings, and they did wargaming, and they did a war game with Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings, and that sounds pretty stinking cool to me because they built the whole entire thing. But at the same time, you're having fun, right? It's similar to I like grand strategy games for the computer or video games, right? I like grand strategy games. I'm not benefiting anybody else from playing those. At the same time, I'm entertaining myself. It's similar to playing any type of video game, right? It's similar to playing it's a simulation of some sort. If you're doing world building, it's simulating the world that it's simulating the fantasy world. That's what I'm trying to say. The fantasy world is never going to be never going to be real, right? It's never going to exist in the real world. But at the same time, if you write it down, you're able to flesh out what that looks like in your mind. Now, quick pause on this. If you don't know, there's something called a memory palace or a memory castle. And what people use these for, it's legit. People actually have these. So what people do or memory mansion. What people do is they create a mansion or a castle or a palace in their mind. They keep on building onto it in their mind. So it's kind of like what you're doing with world building, but they're doing it for the specific reason for remembering things. And what they do is they create this this space within their mind. They develop this space within their mind. They get intimately, what would you call it? Acquainted with this memory palace, this structure, this building that only exists in their mind. And what they can do is since they are so acquainted with it, is they actually, they want to remember something, so they take that thing in their mind, they pretend they're going through that building, and they put it in a specific place in that memory palace. And the reason why it works is because if you have a context around what you're trying to remember, you remember it a lot better. So if you are someone who understands a academic field, and you have studied that academic field, you have tons of context to remember all the different parts to that academic field. It might be the case that if somebody asks you one specific detail about that academic field, you might not have the answer off the top of your head. But at the same time, because you have the context, you're able to remember that little detail plus so much more, because you're connecting it to a broader context. We actually do this with stories as well. You might not be able to remember something by itself, a little tiny fact, but if you couch it in the context of a story, you're probably going to be able to remember that a lot better, because it's a context we understand very well. It's a context that's, I would think, built into humans. I think the story and how people respond to stories is built into humans, which I think is very interesting. And maybe it's not built in, but it's something that's an extreme. If stories aren't built into humans, like we just are born, and once we get to a certain age, once we start understanding speech, we understand stories. Once we get to that age, because little kids like stories as well. That's why I say that. But we get to a certain age where we can understand what people are saying, we can understand speech, and we really like stories. So I would assume that since we like them so early on in our lives, they're actually some component of us that's just built into us. It's kind of like language acquisition. Babies can learn languages because there's a built-in structure. There's some reason, there's some biological component to humans that allows them to develop language, right, as a baby, as a really small child, and they suddenly are able to talk, right? This is actually in terms of people being born with a language acquisition device, if we want to call it that, it's built into the biology. I can't remember any words right now. Some evidence for that is that babies babble in different sounds from different languages before they actually get the language of their parents. They actually are able to speak the language of their parents. Like I said, I'm having a hard time remembering words today for some reason. But going back to your memory palace, it's couched within a context. The story is a context. The memory palace is a context. For those of you creating fantasy worlds, consider using your fantasy world as a memory palace. Okay? But yeah, you might have no interest in writing. You might just like having fun, and there's no issue with having fun and doing something like that. Some people fear I don't know how true this one is, but some people I think probably fear that they're not going to be able to write as well as what they see in their mind. So they have these great ideas, and they keep on building and building and building. And because they keep on building, and they have this ideal story that's playing out in their mind, and they have specific emotions attached to it. And they're like, I'm never going to be able to do it the way I want to. Since I'm never going to be able to do it the way I want to, I might as well not just. I'm afraid of writing the story. I'm not going to do that. Or some people might just not know what story to tell. So that this goes back to kind of the first one. They have no interest in writing. Somebody might not have interest in writing a story. Some people might want to write a story, but all they've got is the fantasy world. And you can only do so much with a fantasy world if you're a game designer, like a video game designer, go for it. You're in a great place if you're developing a fantasy world. But if you're a writer, it's a little different, because you do need a story, because the stories, we write books to tell stories. You could maybe say that you tell stories through games, right? Video games, but at the same time, the game component comes into that. So games aren't the same things as stories. You have to have a game within a game. Like there has to be gameplay within a video game, otherwise it doesn't work generally. There's only one. If it only tells a story, The question is, should we even call it a video game? Or this last one, I don't think is the case. It might be the case that somebody's just lazy. They're just procrastinating and they're avoiding the work they need to do. Some people actually create story Bibles. I'm gonna actually get mine out if I can find it. So, oh crap. So I'm gonna get mine. Okay. So like I was saying, it goes into things like, oh, this is this group of people, as in the culture, so it's usually, I'm guessing that most of us who do this start out with a map, and then you populate the map, and the map creates a framework for how you're going to do everything. And I'm going to actually go in, so I actually do this to a certain degree, okay? So I'm writing a series, and this is my, it's not what you typically think of as a story Bible, okay? But what I did with this is I have a specific process for writing a book, and it starts with research. It starts with any idea I want. I add any idea I want. After I add any idea I want into the story, I start to narrow it down. I just make a list of ideas. That's what I mean. After I make a list of ideas, I start to narrow it down to ideas that I want. After I do that, I start to build a basic structure of the story. After I build the basic structure of the story, I start to, like the basic outline of the story, I start to fill the story in. So in this one, if I open up to some of the first pages, this has some of my ideas, right? There's just lists of things in here. Lists of different ideas I wanted to have in here. There's some... this is so beat up right now. I have a timeline, right? I have a timeline, different things like that. I have different names of books that I want. I have a lot of different things in here. And the reason why I made this is because I was writing a series and I wanted to know where I was going with the series. So I needed to plan out the series beforehand to at least a certain degree. It doesn't have every little detail of every little book in there, but it does have the general direction I'm moving with the series. So yeah, I know how it's going to end. So if somebody's writing a series, they might have something like that. Yeah, so I don't blame them if they have something like that when they're writing a series. But that's a little different because I'm not writing different facts or different things about I'm not writing facts or different things about the world that I'm building. To a certain degree I am, but to a certain degree it's on the fly. So I have the story I'm writing and I know where that story is going, and I come up with ideas that I have about how that story is going to go, and then I create them as I'm writing, but I'm not filling them up with words. But I do have another one. So I'm working on, is this the correct one? Let's see. I'm working on another, and this isn't actually my notebook, but I'm working on a children's fantasy series, and I haven't even started writing it. But on the side, it's my fun thing that I work on if I have extra time, right? It's something that's going to come in the future, but right now I'm planning the world around it. So I'm actually creating a story Bible, if you want to call it that, for this fantasy series that I'm creating. And the reason why it's a fantasy series, but it's more of like standalone books in a fantasy series. The reason why I'm creating it is because I'm trying to develop a specific world, and I'm trying to develop specific cultures, right? I'm trying to develop a specific system of magic that's different than other people's that I've seen in the past, that comes across differently. The reason why I'm creating that is because I want a specific emotion and experience when people read the book. Right, I want people to be swept up in this fantasy, this dreamlike fantasy, and if I have the details of that dreamlike fantasy, I can do that better. Right. The question that some people might ask I'm going back a little bit. The question some people might ask with story building disease is it good or bad? And what I would say is, if it keeps you from writing, then I would say it's a bad thing. But I don't think it's necessarily bad, okay? Now, I might be biased because I do it myself, but there's a very good reason why I do something like that myself. Now, like I said, The first notebook I showed you was the outline I did of my book. The reason why I created the outline, of the series, not just the book, the reason why I created the outline of the whole entire series is because I wanted to know specific details as I went through this whole process. Because if I know the details, specific details of the whole series, as I write through the series, I can put specific things in that is going to make the series so much richer than if I didn't know the ending or specific details as I was going through that process. And the idea of a story Bible is the same concept. So at the beginning of this podcast, I said that when someone is writing in the present day and they're writing a thriller and they're not creating a new world for it, they don't need to... what they can do is they can say something about the world, and people already live in that world. It's likely that people already live in that world, and they can assume what is going on in that situation, right? And even if people don't live in that world, people tend, if you're writing historical fiction, people tend to have an idea of what went on during that time period. You're not world building when you're writing historical fiction. You're actually doing research into the history so that you can present the world as it was back then. And since people generally have a specific idea about different eras in history, people take their framework of that era in history and they place it on what you're writing, no matter what. People are always going to take their ideas and place it on your writing no matter what. So that's why some people are going to like your writing and some people aren't. Now, it might be good to... it's always good to see whether your writing is good. It's always good to test. It's always good to push. It's always good to figure out whether your writing is good. So it might not. If people don't like your writing at all, it might be the case that it's not good, and you just have to develop. You just have to get better. But when you're approaching something like fantasy is different because the world you're creating for fantasy does not exist. And if you start writing fantasy without doing any world building, you might end up writing a fantastic fantasy story, right? You might end up writing a fantastic fantasy story, but when you create that story, the world you're creating around that story it's probably the case that you're creating a believable. The world you're creating around that story is believable, most likely by accident, okay? And it probably brings in some stuff. It's a little different. So when you're writing something on the fly, this is why I'm not a pantser. Pantser is someone who will just write a book and they won't do any planning. But the reason why I'm not a pantser is because there's a lot of different ideas I want to bring into a story. And if I just write the story, I'm going to miss so many ideas I want to include. Now, some of those ideas probably shouldn't be included, okay? And I think that's perfectly fine. And I always do cutting when I do writing. I almost always do cutting of different things. But there's some ideas that I might strike gold, and I might have not come up with that idea if I didn't take time to actually plan out at least part of the book, okay? But when you are writing a fantasy series, it's similar to doing that historical fiction. So like I said, historical fiction is doing research. When you write a fantasy series and you're creating that story Bible, you're doing research to figure out how that world is going to work, how it's going to look, and everything like that. And when you develop that story Bible, when you develop that fantasy world, you become acquainted with it, right? You get to know how that fantasy world works, and when you know how the real world works, you can incorporate little nuances and details from the real world into your story to make your story better, okay? So this is why I always say that it's good to understand things, right? It's good to understand the world. It's good to have new experiences, more experiences, right? We as writers don't just want to read books, and we don't want to just write. We want to get out into the world. We want to meet new people. We want to talk to people who are different than us. We want to jump out of airplanes and fall with a parachute and stuff like that. I mean, I don't, but you know what I mean. We want to have these new experiences, so we have more things to pull from, because in the end, the most powerful things that you are probably going to pull from are from your own experiences. Okay. One of the biggest things that we need to understand as writers is how people work. We need to understand the emotions of people. We need to understand what moves people. We need to understand how people interact. It's not necessarily the case that we are always going to be writing these in-depth conversations or what would you call it, bios of people within our books. But if we understand people, which at the heart of story, okay, let me say it again. If we understand people, we're going to be able to write better stories. The reason why we're going to be able to write better stories if we understand people is because at the heart of story is character change, right? And at the heart of character change is the character. At the heart of the character is a person. So if we can better understand people and how they work and have different types of people, it's going to make our stories more interesting. And any type of nuance you're going to be able to bring into your story is going to make the story more interesting. Now, your story might fall flat in some way, but it's likely that nuance is still going to be something interesting. People read books for different reasons. People like books for different reasons. And it might very well be the case that you have this very unique perspective on some idea because you've had an experience in your life. And that unique perspective on that idea might draw a reader to you. Now, this all connects back to world building because we understand people in the real world. We understand how that works. We understand emotions. The thing that translates from the real world to the fantasy world is the emotional side, is the human side. It's the human experience. But the actual fantasy world the actual world doesn't transfer, right? And the better we're able to understand that fantasy world, the better we're going to be able to bring that in and present it in a realistic way to the people who are reading our books. And I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over my words today for some reason. I just don't get why I am. But I am. I need to slow down. That's probably what's happening right now. So yeah, you do need to do work. You don't always need to do the work of building a framework for a story, but I generally think you're lazier if you're stealing somebody else's. And most people realize when you're stealing somebody else's framework for a story, or someone's framework for a fantasy world. That's why people tend to frown on, what is it called? Fan fiction. People tend to frown on fan fiction because it's a shortcut for not doing your own work, which I think you should do your own work. And if you're a really good fan fiction writer, write your own book. Be like, hey, I'm a really good fan fiction writer. People love my stuff. Here's my own work. Let's see if you like that. And maybe some people will be enamored with it. They'll love it so much. But yeah, so that's my perspective on it. I do world building. And the reason I do world building is because if I don't do the world building, I'm going to run into a detail about the world that I'm working within. And I'm going to be like, what should I do with this? And I might be lazy. I might not have good ideas. So how I work it and how I get around doing that is I have multiple books going on at once. I have certain books that are quicker. I get them done faster, right? I have the challenge to do One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet once a month, and I've been doing that. I think I'm up to the 13th chapter that I'm working on right now. But I've been doing that once a month, and I've been getting it out once a month, and forces me to go faster. And I've been playing a little faster and loose with that, but I'm dealing with a world I already understand, right? An alternate timeline that I already understand. But in my other book, my other work, the stuff that I'm working on, the series that I'm working on, I'm taking much longer time because I want to have that as good as I'm. Pretty much how I work with that book is I want it the best I'm able to do. And then on top of that, I'm also working on this fantasy series that I'm doing world building with. So maybe that's the shortcut around where you have multiple things that you're working on at once. You're always doing writing every day, but it's something that isn't so close to your heart, right? And this goes back to what I was talking about last week or the week before, where I said fall out of love with your work. And the reason why I said fall out of love with your work is because it allows you to actually get work done. So that's what I think about world building. I think that it's something that can be very useful. I think it can be very distracting. I think if you don't care about writing a book, then who cares? It's just something fun for you to do. It's like model trains or model airplanes or something like that. It's like painting, you know. You might put paintings up on walls, or you might just do it because you find it fun. You might do drawing. Drawing is something that could be considered idle. It might be similar. And drawing, you might keep all your drawings in a book and never show anybody, right? In world building is the same thing. You might just do it for fun, and I have no issue with that whatsoever. If you're someone who wants to write, then you've got to just make time every single day to do writing. And if it's a story, if it's like a story you don't mind screwing up, then just write your story every day that you don't mind screwing up, pants it, I guess, and then do your world building on the side, and that will help you make a robust world that you want to create, and at the same time put work out. Because one of the things I do tell newer writers is, if you want to be a writer, start publishing right away. Start putting work out into the world, because people will forgive your bad work, right? People are willing to forgive the bad work you're doing. And if you start putting work out into the world, you'll have reactions from people to see how whether they like your work or not. You might be pleasantly surprised. The average person does not need the best book in the world to enjoy it. There's a reason why some people write the same book over and over again, and people read every single one of their books. It's because those people they just want to write, right? People read those books because they aren't as picky as you are picky. Okay, try to do your best, of course. Don't put out trash. Try to put something out you're proud of. But you do have your lifetime to develop your writing, right? You don't have to be the best writer in the world right now, and you're not going to be the best writer in the world right now. So write a book on the side. Do world building on the other. When you're done with your world building, or if you're sufficiently done with your world building to write the book, write the stinking book then, right? You don't need to have every single detail of the world figured out to write the book, but there might be specific details you need to figure out, okay? And that's understandable. There's almost certainly details you need to figure out. And that goes back to whether you are someone who just writes books and you don't do any planning, or whether you're someone who does planning. And this is definitely on the far, far side of planning. You are in the extreme of the planner if you do this. And that's okay. That's okay. You can still figure it out, and you can still do writing on the side. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice, or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you. Let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website. Check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places. All right. So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that out on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.